are the kings of optical compromise. And yes, I mean that as a compliment. Whether you're talking about the great 28-70 f2, the new 24-105 f2.8, the legendary 11-24mm lens, or the new 800mm f11, or the colossal 1200mm f5.6L lens, Canon have a long history of designing lenses outside of the norm that have specs that other manufacturers aren't quite offering, finding a market for it and making it commercially viable. Side note on that 1200mm monster lens that was originally released in 1993 with a price tag of close to $90,000 US, which adjusted for today's money is like over $190,000. Which is crazy, but one of them sold used in 2021 for 580 grand. Madness. What was I talking about? Compromises, lens design. Yes, lens design always involves a trade-off. If you want optical perfection, it's going to add size, weight, and cost, and that last 3 to 5% of imaging perfection might triple the overall cost of production. If you want a faster aperture, it's going to mean larger lens elements, more heavy components, stronger autofocus motors, better engineering, and as the price goes up, the market size shrinks and shrinks. Whilst we would all love a 50 to 500mm f2 lens that's hand-holdable, if they were able to actually engineer something like that, it might cost $1 million by the time it came to market. That's where lenses like this guy come into play. The 200 to 800 from Canon, huge zoom range, reasonable size, reasonable weight, pretty good price. What's the trade-off in this case? The aperture. So this guy has a bit of an unconventional variable aperture. At 200mm, you start out at f6.3. At 268mm, it drops off to f7.1. At 455mm, it's at f8, and it reaches f9 at 637mm and stays there all the way through to 800mm. Now, I think there are 3 questions that we need to answer in this video. How does it perform in the field? How is the optical image quality? And who is this aperture range likely to actually work for? So to test this guy out, I first took it along to a bird park at the same time that I was testing the new bird autofocus update to the Nikon Z8. Side note, the R5 and the Z8 are really different in the hand, and given that the R5 doesn't have bird detect autofocus, that really stood out as I was shooting the two of them side by side. That said, the 200 to 800 was easily hand holdable. The zoom is nice and smooth. It has the dial here so you can adjust if it's smoother or tighter for the focus ring. I found it, fine to use. It was a nice experience. I did, however, find that the focus ring is kind of small and awkward here. Being that far back, it's a little hard to get to, and yeah, it's just a little bit small. I also found there is some definite lens creep on the lens. If you don't have it fully locked down into the tight position and then wound back to 200mm before you start walking, it will start to creep itself out. Next up, we headed out to the wetlands up near Shenzhen in the north of Hong Kong in the hope that the cooler weather at this time of year would help us catch more birds. Well, this is a good sign. I've been to this wetland maybe 5 times, always at the wrong time of year, hardly seen any birds. I can see more here through the glass than I have on my previous trips combined, so this should work out well. Now, we did get some birds as well as some butterflies and little fishies, and this location reinforced a reality of long lens shooting that makes shooting at f9 a little bit difficult at times. Now, when you're doing long lens stuff, you often find yourself in locations like this that are surprisingly dark, several stops darker than it is if you were in open light. Now, there's 3 things to keep in mind with the aperture that a long lens is giving you, or any lens really. One, of course, is what it's able to do in terms of blurring out the background. We all know that, and in busy backgrounds, that is an issue. The second one is what do you have in terms for exposure? So being a f9, it is relatively really slow, but at 800mm, you think about like the best of the best, a 5.6 or 6.3. This is really only a stop or a little bit beyond slower than that, so not a big difference. But whilst the modern cameras are able to autofocus beyond f11 even, it does mean you have that much less light to focus with. So you're going to find on any camera from any system, no matter how sophisticated the autofocus, you're going to find your autofocus is not as good at f9 as it would be on something that's like an f4 and f2.8 that has 4 or 8 times the amount of light to focus with. I have to say, the more reach the better when shooting birds, and I really appreciated being able to easily handhold this guy all day without needing a monopod. That said, I was often finding that the camera and lens combo wasn't able to identify birds in those scenarios, especially with busy foregrounds or backgrounds. Now, I don't know if that's a limitation of the R5 and its autofocus modes. Most likely it's a combination of the two. This one having a slower aperture, it's not able to so precisely isolate the bird and blur out the foreground and background to correctly identify it and lock onto it. I found it was often the focus was just dancing around in the foreground or background and wouldn't identify the bird in animal detect autofocus mode. Overall, I'm really satisfied with the optical performance of this lens. With suitable settings, the right kind of light, and good hand-holding technique, we're getting nice sharpness, color, contrast across the frame throughout these images. Now, I'll make a bunch of sample files available for free download at learn.mattgranger.com. You can see details below. Of course, there's levels to everything, right? And you, to an extent, get what you pay for. This is a mid-range priced lens in the RF range, and you're getting kind of mid-range results. They definitely get the job done. You'll be satisfied, but it's not gonna like blow your hair back like some of the fixed aperture primes or zooms do, but you wouldn't expect that at this price. Now, whilst I'm generally happy with the optical quality of the lens, there's one thing that's inextricably linked to your final image quality that we just have to address, and that's your ISO. Now, it may seem strange to discuss ISO in a lens review. ISO is a function of the camera, but the fact that this has a slow aperture means that in a lot of situations, your ISO is going to go up. You don't always have the opportunity to just add light to a scene, and you don't always have the opportunity to vary your shutter speed. For example, if you're shooting a bird in flight, you would know there's a minimum shutter speed you need to get the shot sharp, which means if I'm shooting at f9 as opposed to f4 on my lens, I'm going to need to increase my ISO by one hell of a lot. We simply can't skirt this issue. Higher ISOs degrade your image quality, period. Doesn't matter the camera, doesn't matter what software you're using later. It's not just about the dots that you see in the file that some whiz bang, editing software can now reduce. You're losing tonal range, you're losing color range, and you're losing fine detail. And as good as those software are, I haven't seen one yet that can replicate a shot that was just shot with the correct settings at a low ISO, getting the best out of the lens, rather than having AI try and guess what the detail was supposed to be. In the wetlands, I went as high as ISO 5000, and in the bird park, I was even up to ISO 12800. That's using the f9 lens. If I were using an f6.3 lens, my apertures would have been halved. If I were using like a 4.5 lens, they would have been a quarter of that level. And you can't get around that. If you're shooting at ISO 3200 versus 12800, you're going to get noticeably better files on the lower ISO. Again, no matter what camera you're using. And at the end of the day, using a long lens with a slow aperture, that's what's essentially going to, in the end, for a lot of you, degrade your image quality. The higher ISO that results from the slower aperture that you get on this guy. So will this guy suit your style of shooting? Honestly, I have no idea. Unfortunately, that's a question that you're going to have to answer for yourself. To determine it, I would recommend you go back through your library, your catalog of images, look at the kind of images that you tend to shoot with, that you're thinking you'll shoot with this, so your birds or your wildlife, whatever it may be, or sports. and then do the maths. Figure out what kind of settings are you likely to need to be at if you're out at 800mm with this lens at f9. Are you going to need to be up at ISO 32,000 or only at ISO 4000? And then figure out if that's going to work for you. Take a look at the camera that you shoot with at those ISO levels and see if the results are suitable. It's going to vary camera to camera and person to person, because at the end of the day, your tolerance for the high ISO noise really is personal. Of course, if you're shooting with an R5, then you can download the sample files that I've made available below and pixel peep them to your heart's content. I have a whole range of different ISOs included there. My overall verdict is that this is a really nice lens, a great compromise optic that is a worthy addition to the RF lens range. Here's hoping that Canon are going to make the ultimate compromise, the one that Canon users are really waiting for, and that's to allow third-party manufacturers access to the RF mount sooner rather than later. The more choices, the better. Let me know your thoughts.